Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 74, Part 2, Mary Hyde. I suggest you go back and listen to Part 1 of Mary Hyde's story, where it outlines her first marriage and her second marriage. This episode outlines Mary's life after the death of her second husband, Simeon Lord, and the descendants of Mary. After her husband's death, Mary, in addition to managing large livestock and land holdings, continued the manufacturing business in the factory at Botany. She employed many local people in the milling and dressing of cloth and the making of hats, stockings, leather, shoes, candles and harnesses, until the business had to be closed due to the flooding of part of her Botany property and the loss of the stream which drove the mill. In the beginning of 1855, in litigation worthy of her late husband, Mary sued the commissioners of the city of Sydney. In July 1855, by notification in the Government Gazette, approximately 30 acres were resumed for a reserve for a water supply in Sydney. The land resumed included land owned by Mary on which her woolen mill stood. Compensation was offered, but the amount offered was disputed as unreasonable. 76-year-old Mary took the commissioners of the City of Sydney to the Supreme Court of New South Wales. For 31.5 acres with a mill, a dwelling house, some outbuildings and water privileges, Mrs. Mary Lord claims £30,000. In December 1855, in the third and last action taken by the residents whose land had been resumed, she partially won her case. Held over 2 days, the case included a special jury of 12, travelling from the courthouse to Botany to view the land that had been resumed. The jury assessed the damages for £11,500 and assessed the contingent damages for the loss of additional water usage at a little over £7,000. The Supreme Court directed a new trial unless Mary agreed to reduce the amount of the damages that she had been awarded, to which she consented. The fight was not yet over, however, as there was still the issue of the contingent damages to which she believed she was entitled. Showing her tenacity, Mary appealed her case to the Privy Council in England, the final court of appeal then available to a British subject living in the colony of New South Wales. The judgment was delivered on the 12th of February 1859 after Mary had turned 80. News of the verdict took over 2 months to reach Australia, but Mary had been awarded the final £7,200 and her costs. Lord Kingsdown, the judge of the Admiralty Court, decided, despite contrary arguments from the defendants, that Mary had been entitled to the undisturbed use of water on her land that had been resumed, and she was entitled to the extra compensation. So her total compensation as a result of the court actions reached £15,500. Mary is perhaps the first and possibly only female, and female convict at that, to have taken a legal case from New South Wales to the Privy Council. Mary died on the 1st of December 1864 at the age of 85 in the family home Banks House, named after Sir Joseph Banks at Botany. She was the matriarch of a large, notable Australian family, and she'd already settled large amounts of her estate on her children before she died. Probate on her remaining estate was granted on the 24th of August 1865 and came in at the value of £11,000. In her will, she named all her 10 children, although some had predeceased her. Mary was also specifically concerned for her daughters and granddaughters. She stipulated that any bequests made to her daughters and granddaughters were to be given to them in their own right and that their husbands should not have any say. She attempted to give her daughters and granddaughters control over their own inheritances. However, the law of the day overrode her stated wishes. Remember, the colonies in Australia were largely governed by English law, and prior to 1887, when the Married Woman's Property Act was introduced, a married woman prior to that could own no property in her own name. It was always the chattel of her husband. Any property she owned as a single woman or that she inherited as a married woman, whether it was goods, money or land, had to pass into the ownership of her husband. So what became of the children? Well, first of all, Simeon Lord's adopted daughter, Joanna Henrietta Short, was born on the 29th of September 1792 in Sydney. Her biological parents were Joseph Short and Elizabeth Drury, both convicts. Elizabeth Drury died in August 1793, and Joseph died in December 1795. So as a result, being only a little over 3 years old, Johanna was adopted by Simeon Lord. Johanna married Francis Williams, and as mentioned earlier, he was one of Simeon's business partners. On the 17th of November 1806, at St Philip's Church of England, Sydney, Johanna was 14 and Francis 26. Francis Williams had been born in 1780. He had left England and appeared to have joined the cargo ship Lucy on a journey through South American waters, attacking Spanish shipping, and crossed the Pacific to Port Jackson for repairs in April 1806. Soon after his arrival, he was employed by Simeon. Francis, however, did not have official permission to enter the colony, and Governor Bligh ordered his deportation and advised the British government that he should not be allowed to return as a settler. He left Sydney in November 1807, carrying commissions from Simeon Lord and letters to England for Darcy Wentworth. Darcy had described him as a very respectable young gentleman. In England, Williams executed personal and commercial business for Lord on his behalf, and he went to America to wind up the matter of the Criterion cargo. In 1809, he applied for permission to settle in New South Wales and returned to Sydney in January 1810 and immediately entered into full partnership with Lord. He acquired farming interests in the Hawkesbury River, and Governor Macquarie appointed him as a trustee and commissioner of the turnpike between Sydney and the Hawkesbury. In addition to the wholesale and retail business, the firm of Lord and Williams had interests in manufacturing and timber, and in 1810 made an unsuccessful attempt to establish a flax industry in New Zealand. In July 1811, Williams sailed for Calcutta on the Aurora, an American brig, which the firm had chartered to expedite contracts on behalf of the government for the shipment of wheat, sugar and rum from Bengal. But it was not until October 1812 that Williams returned to the Hope with the cargo of supplies, which was diverted to the Derwent on Macquarie's orders. He spent several months in Hobart Town and bought stock there to set up as a farmer and grazier. He returned to Sydney in March 1813 and requested Macquarie's permission to exchange the 800-acre grant he received in 1812 in the Hawkesbury district for a similar grant in Van Diemen's Land. Macquarie agreed and ordered that he receive the utmost indulgences of a free settler. In July 1813, the partnership with Lord was dissolved and Williams left for Van Diemen's Land. In the next year, he was appointed a magistrate at Hobart, but his grazing concerns seemed to have little success. In February 1818, he was again in Sydney and had obtained the position of an accountant with the Bank of New South Wales. In September 1820, the directors of the bank requested him to resign as he had made unauthorised advances to the extent of £2,000, which they were obliged to call in. No doubts of his integrity appeared to have been entertained, but a few weeks after his resignation, it was discovered that the sealed bags of notes, which he left for his successor, were £12,000 short. It was then found that he had in effect made unauthorised advances to that extent to oblige various individuals and had concealed his actions by entering non-existent deposits in the bank books. In March 1822, he was tried and convicted of embezzlement. He appears to have made little personal profit from these clandestine transactions. The bank recovered £6,000 from his sureties and about £4,000 from 3 of the customers to whom he granted favours, though 2 of them were still being pressed for a final settlement almost 10 years later. Williams was sentenced to transportation for 14 years and appears he passed his servitude first as a clerk in the government store and later as clerk to the bench at the Newcastle Penal Settlement. He was granted a ticket of leave in 1828 and set up as an agent at Newcastle, and he died at Lucantyre, one of Thomas Winter's estates, on the 6th of October 1831, aged 51. His career was an unusual reversal of the botany-based success story. After a profitable association with Lord, his decision to abandon trade for the life of a country gentleman was unsuccessful, and his final disgrace seems to be due to weakness and a desire for prestige and popularity rather than any premeditated plan for monetary gain. Johanna died at Paterson, New South Wales in 1865, aged 73. They had no children. Mary and John Black's children. Their oldest, John Henry Black, was born on the 31st of May 1799, and he became the first manager of the Bank of New South Wales. From 1825, he managed his stepfather's hat-making business. He then married Louisa Armitage on the 14th of June 1827 at St James Church of England, Sydney. Louisa had been born on the 19th of April 1808. Her father, Charles Armitage, came out on the fortune in 1806. John and Louisa had 8 children, and 3 of their children are buried with Simeon Lord. Edward Simeon Black, second son of John Henry Black, and he died on the 23rd of September 1846, aged 9 years, 1 month and 1 day. So he was born on the 22nd of August 1837. The second child, Louisa Mary Black, was born in 1831 and died in 1846. And a third child buried with Simeon Lord was John Henry Black, who died on the 11th of October 1846, aged 13 years, 9 months and 3 days, so born on the 8th of February 1833. John Black died on the 9th of June 1867, aged 68. John Black and Mary Hyde's second child, Mary Ann Black, she was born on the 6th of October 1801. In 1807, Mary sent her daughter to England with Simeon Lord's adopted daughter Johanna and her husband Francis to be placed into the care of the child's grandfather, Reverend John Black. In February 1807, the then 5-year-old left on board the Lord's ship, the Commerce, but the ship returned to Sydney in April 1807 after picking up shipwrecked men and sustaining damage in a storm. In July 1807, Mary was baptised at St Philip's Church in Sydney. Then in November 1807, Mary began a second voyage to England aboard another of Lord's ships, the Sydney Cove. Young Mary Ann Black did not return to Australia until 1814 after her grandfather's death. Mary married the Sydney merchant Jean Charles Prosper de Mestre on the 1st of March 1821 at St Philip's Church of England in Sydney. Jean Charles Prosper de Mestre, known as Prosper, was born at sea in a British ship on the way to the West Indies in 1789. He was the son of a French officer fleeing from France during the Revolution. At Martinique, his father was killed, and his mother later married a British officer, Captain Armstrong. At the evacuation of Martinique after the Peace of Amiens, he was sent to school at Philadelphia, where he remained until 1812. He then went to China, later lived at Mauritius and India, and arrived in New South Wales on the Magnet in August 1818. In Sydney, Prosper began business as an importer, but his mercantile activities soon aroused opposition. He was regarded as an American citizen and was said to be able to import tea through his countrymen in China and undersell other Sydney merchants who had to buy it through the East India Company. In an attempt to ruin him, an action was brought against him in 1820 under an act that prohibited aliens from trading in the King's plantations. Had this succeeded, all of de Mestre's property would have been forfeited, 2/3 of it going to the King and the Governor, and the remainder to the informer. De Mestre pleaded that the person who took him to court, an emancipist by the name of Eager, was a convicted felon and could not sue in a court of justice, and Baron Field agreed, and the action went no further. In 1825, William Charles Wentworth, acting for him, successfully urged the Legislative Council for a special act to naturalise de Mestre. Under this act, he took the necessary oaths in September 1825 and was the second person to be naturalised in Australia. The legality of this ceremony was doubted in 1830 when he applied to register a ship, but Chief Justice Sir Francis Forbes ruled that because he had been born on the high seas in a British ship, he was a British subject, and therefore his application must succeed. In 1823, de Mestre had a small farm at Bargo, and in 1829 he was granted 1,300 acres, which he called Tarara on the Shoalhaven River. He was also very active in the commercial and business life of the colony. He was a director of the Bank of New South Wales from 1826 to 1842. He was also a director of several companies, including the Marine Insurance Company in the 1830s. He was a founder of the Mutual Fire Insurance Company of Sydney in 1840. He was interested in shipping and began whaling in the 1820s, and towards the end of his life owned many houses in Sydney. His residence and counting house were the first in George Street, Sydney, and later in Liverpool Street. However, de Mestre became insolvent in 1844 and he died at Tarara after a short illness on the 14th of September 1844. Mary Ann and Prosper had 10 children. One of their 3 sons, Etienne Livingston de Mestre, established a horse stud at Tarara and won 5 Melbourne Cups, including the first 2 Melbourne Cups with the horse Archer in 1861 and 1862. Mary Ann died at Tarara on the 11th of July 1861. And Mary and Simeon Lord's children. Their first child, Sarah Ann Lord, was born on the 3rd of March 1806. She married David Ramsay on the 31st of March 1825 at St Philip's Church in Sydney. David was 12 years older than Sarah. He was a medical practitioner and a merchant, and he'd been born on the 16th of March 1794 in Perth, Scotland, the third child of John Ramsay, a prosperous corn merchant and miller. David Ramsay was educated in Perth and Scotland University, and he became a medical practitioner in 1817. In 1818, he sought a hospital appointment in London but was unsuccessful. Reluctant to become a surgeon's assistant confined to a shop making up medicines with no opportunity of improving his medical education, he accepted the post of surgeon on the Marchioness of Exeter at a monthly salary of £5, the use of the captain's table, and liberty to trade a little. He made a modest profit on a voyage to East Indies. After toying with the idea of furthering his professional knowledge at the University of Paris, early in 1820 he accepted a post on the Surrey with Captain Thomas Raine, going to New South Wales. After 4 months in Sydney, he sailed for Valparaiso in the Surrey. On the way, Ramsay did useful natural history work on several islands, including Pitcairn. In June 1821, he was back in Sydney, with which he was greatly impressed, but in February 1822, he embarked once more on the Surrey, now taking Governor Macquarie and his family back to England. Ramsay's appetite was whetted by what he considered great commercial possibilities of New South Wales, and aided by influential friends, he made arrangements to establish a house of agency and import and export business with Raine as partner. Leaving England on the Talia late in 1822, Ramsay reached Sydney in June 1823. With the establishment of the well-known house of Raine and Ramsay, his career as a doctor appeared to have ended. There's no evidence available that he ever practiced medicine. In 1828, when Ramsay discovered that Raine was misappropriating large funds belonging to the firm for his personal use, the partnership was dissolved. Although for a time short of funds, Ramsay continued to develop both his commercial and pastoral interests, including a grant of 2,000 acres he was given on the bank of the Fish River. When he married Sarah, he acquired Dobroyd Farm, a wedding present from his father-in-law. It was 480 acres of land, about 9.5 kilometres from Sydney Central. Much of it is now covered by the suburb of Haberfield. Ramsay described it as one of the finest places in New South Wales, the oranges in the orchard alone being worth £100 per year. Ramsay took an active part in public affairs. He was treasurer of the Presbyterian Church in 1823, a signatory to its constitution drawn up in 1824, and a strong supporter of his fellow members in their efforts to build Scots Church in Sydney. Upright but shrewd, dignified but warmly affectionate, Ramsay was a man of high principles. He was deeply religious, and he followed all his life the strict path of Presbyterian orthodoxy. Although not possessed of great intellectual gifts, he was versatile enough to succeed as a doctor and as a student of natural history and a man of business. He had as well some taste and talent for music. His letters reveal him to be a dutiful son and a devoted father and husband. Sarah and David had 11 children. Their third youngest son, Edward Pearson Ramsay, was a noted ornithologist who for 20 years was curator of the Australian Museum in Sydney. David Ramsay died on the 10th of June 1860 and was buried on Dobroyd, and Sarah died on the 28th of January 1889 at the age of 82. Simeon and Mary's second child, Mary Louisa Lord, known as Louisa, was born on the 8th of July 1808 at Pymble, New South Wales. She married Captain Alexander Dick on the 5th of June 1824 at the residence of her father in Sydney Street. She was only 15 and Alexander was 36. Alexander was captain of the East India Company's military service on the Bengal establishment. Alexander Dick was born on the 3rd of April 1786 at Perthshire, Scotland. He joined the British Army in 1803 in Scotland. He was an ensign on the 5th of October 1804 in the British Army. Then he was promoted to lieutenant in the 2nd 17th Native Infantry. He arrived in India on the 3rd of December 1804. He served in the 5th Volunteer Battalion during the Second Maharata War, capture of Java and siege of Cornelis. He was on the 1st of January 1819 promoted to captain in the British Army. He was transferred on the 1st of July 1823 to the 31st Native Infantry at India. On the 22nd of April 1826, he was promoted to Major in the British Army. and he was on the 20th of June 1854 promoted to Major General, Bengal Infantry in the British Army. On the 3rd of May 1866 he was promoted to General, and he died on the 25th of November 1875 in India at the age of 89. Mary and Alexander had 9 children. Their first 2 sons also served in the military and rose to Lieutenant Colonel in the British Army, and Mary died on the 22nd of June 1896 in India, aged 87. Their third child, Simeon Lord Jr., was born on the 19th of May 1810 in Sydney. He lived in Tasmania and Queensland and was a pastoralist, and he married Sarah Birch in New Norfolk, Tasmania, on the 15th of June 1834. They departed Tasmania in 1868 and moved to Queensland, purchasing land and naming it Victoria Downs. Simeon Jr. died on the 15th of June 1892 at his home Hyde in Brisbane, Queensland. And a couple of articles mentioned at the time of his death, one in Tasmania. Another old resident has passed away. Mr. Simeon Lord, one of the oldest residents in Tasmania, was the owner of several properties in Tasmania, including a choice estate at St Helens, Georges Bay, and many other good pastoral estates. In Queensland, he owned much station property and was throughout life a methodical, shrewd and prosperous man of business. He was the father of the late Robert Lord, one-time member of Gympie, and owned a fine pastoral property known as Eskdale on the upper Brisbane River. He was a man of business energy and sterling integrity, and whom the healthy climate of Tasmania laid the foundation of a long, useful and busy life. They had 11 children. 2 of his sons, in fact, became members of Parliament, and 1 daughter married a Queensland Surveyor General. Their 4th child, Francis Allen Lord, was born in 1812. He had a child with Barbara Mill. Her name was Mary, in September 1839 in Bathurst, when Barbara was 19 and Francis 37. This child, Mary, married Richard Machattle, a member of another family prominent in early Australian politics. Francis went on to marry Mary Hainsworth at St Andrew Scots Church in Sydney on the 6th of April 1839 and was a merchant at the time of their marriage, and they had 6 children together. Francis opened and operated a store at Bathurst with his brother-in-law, Strawn Hainsworth. He left this store and became a grazier on land at Cumnock and was the original owner of Burraway. He then owned Mount Lambie at Rydal near Bathurst. The first services at St Barnabas Parish in Bathurst were on land given by Francis Lord at the corner of Bant and Bathurst Streets, which is now the site of St Barnabas Church of England. In 1843, in the first elective council, Francis Lord was elected MLC for Bathurst, and he continued to be a Member of Parliament until his death. Francis moved to St Leonards in Sydney, and in 1868 he was a member of the first council for the borough of East St Leonards. He owned 2 houses in St Leonards which are of historic interest. One is now St Joseph's Convent, called Masalou, after his daughters Mary, Sarah and Louisa, and the second home, the Lodge, was opposite the St Leonards Council Chambers. Francis was closely connected with St Thomas's Church at North Sydney, and he was a member of the committee elected to build a new church on the site of the old one, and he's buried in the cemetery of this church, and he died on the 21st of December 1897 at Rydal, New South Wales. Their 5th child, Edward Wason Lord, was born on the 20th of October 1814. He married Lucy Hyde in the Scots Church in Sydney in 1852 when he was 38 and Lucy was 17. Lucy was in fact Edward's first cousin. Lucy's father was William Hyde, Mary's brother, who was born in 1784 in Worcestershire, England. William Hyde is recorded as dying in Sydney in 1842 when Lucy was only 7. Lucy's mother is recorded on family trees as Mary Weston. However, this is not substantiated by the family tree research. They had 10 children, 8 surviving infancy. Edward died on the 18th of November 1884 at Rockville, New South Wales, and his obituary reads, "When a young man, he entered upon the management of his father's business, developing a large amount of tact and ability. He remained in this position for several years, up until the time of entering office of the City Council, where he filled the position of City Treasurer for 30 years, discharging its onerous activities with conscientiousness and skill. He was regarded as an expert in financial matters, and this led to his occupying prominent positions on the management of several large commercial institutions. Thus, he was a trustee of the Savings Bank, chairman of the board of directors of the Australian Joint Stock Bank, and a director of several companies. He took little part in public matters, but was for many years an alderman of East St Leonards, of which borough he was twice elected mayor. He was once requisitioned to allow himself nominated for the representation of St Leonards, but declined in consequence of ill health. Mr Lord was a man who was universally respected. His manner was courteous, unostentatious and kindly, and he was of a varied, benevolent disposition. David Lord, the well-known and respected champion amateur sculler, who expired about 2 years ago, was his eldest son. And Lucy died in England in 1890. She had returned there after 1887. Another son, Thomas Lord, was born on the 1st of September 1816 and died on the 22nd of November 1876 in North Sydney, aged 60. The seventh child, George William Lord, was born on the 5th of August 1818. He was a pastoralist who journeyed to the Wellington district around 1838. He married Elizabeth Lee at the Trinity Church at Kelso, New South Wales, when he was 32 and Elizabeth was 17. In 1857, he held 25,000 acres of land in the Wellington district and the Riverina. He owned much property in Bathurst and Sydney. He was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly in 1856 and was transferred to the Legislative Council in 1877. He was Colonial Treasurer in 1870 to 1872, a Legislative Councillor in 1877 to 1880, and a prominent company director. He died on the 9th of May 1880 in Darlinghurst and was buried in the family vault. And an obituary on George Lord. The late Honorary George William Lord MLC was the son of the late Mr Simeon Lord JP, one of the most enterprising merchants in Sydney 50 years ago. He was born in Sydney and educated principally at Mr Cape's school, and while he was there he was awarded the Medal for General Proficiency as head scholar. He was married in 1850 to the daughter of late Mr William Lee of Claremont, Kelso. He had 3 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom survive with the exception of one son. When he was 20 years old, he settled as a grazier in the district of Wellington, where he remained for a number of years. In 1856, he entered political life. During his term of office in the Assembly, he accepted the office of Colonial Treasurer in the Third Martin Ministry, which came into office in December 1870. Among the important duties devolving Mr Lord, he occupied the office of Colonial Treasurer, was a representative of this colony in the Intercolonial Conference in Melbourne. He is also a director of the Sydney Insurance Company, as well as the Meat Preserving Company. He accumulated great wealth, for which he combined judgment and enterprise in a degree rarely encountered. And it was mentioned in the chambers of Mr Lord's death, and he was referred to as a gentleman for whom everyone had great respect. He was not a particularly active politician, but succeeded in attaining the position of Colonial Treasurer, and the deceased gentleman was known to be a thoroughly upright and able man. He was undoubtedly a man of great shrewdness and had accumulated a great deal of wealth, and that never led him astray from what he conceived to be the interests of a true colonist. And however much his position had improved, he never forgot what was due to his country and his friends. His goods were sworn in a probate at £90,000. The 8th child, Robert Charles Lord, was born in 1821 in Sydney. He married Elizabeth Wood in 1841 in Sydney. He received a land grant in 1841 and he was involved in the merchant component of his father's business. In August 1841, under colonial manufacture. We have received from Sydney a sample of woolen cloth manufactured by Mr Robert Lord at the Botany Bay Mills, which at once proves the superiority of the colonial wool and the honesty of the manufacturer. We wish the enterprising manufacturer every success and hope that he may yet be able to produce cloths of every description, equal in texture to English manufacture. Robert and Elizabeth had 6 children, and Robert died at Chippendale, New South Wales in 1857, aged only 36, his youngest child only being 2 at the time of his death. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Mary Hyde.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.